Hi everyone, this is Professor Chen again. So let me just get my setup here going, get this on full screen. There we go. So my last video I made for you about the Paleolithic time period was about cave paintings. And this again is when people are hunters and gatherers, they're following the animals, they're nomadic, they're not settled in one place. At the very end of the Paleolithic time period, we have this transitional period that takes place where people are wandering around and they happen into what is today Eastern Europe. And they find wild grasses that are growing there. And these would be the very early forms of wheat and barley and different grains like that. And they collect the grasses and they are able to eat these, like we make bread today out of wheat and eat it. They're making a very primitive kind of, a very early kind of flatbread. So this is a transitional time period because they're collecting the grasses and they're becoming more settled in that area where they actually build some forms of very early forms of homes there, and they collect the grains and eat the grains. They also, though, have groups of them that are still going off for weeks or months at a time, hunting animals and bringing back meat to the settlement, or this very early kind of settlement. And so it's a transitional time period that takes place. Then, unfortunately, what happens is they have this very horrible drought. And when you have wheat and barley and grains like this, you can collect them, and as long as you store them so that they're dry, they last a very long time. So they had stored grain, and so eventually what happens is they take all of the grain that they have left and they begin to walk in search of animals and in search of water. And they walk into what would be considered today the Middle East, into the area of Lake Jordan. And they find Lake Jordan, and on the banks of Lake Jordan, they take the seeds that they have left, the grain that they have left, and they plant it. And they, in essence, become the first farmers. And we'll see next week how this area of what we call the Middle East today is really where we have our first settlements and civilization that we'll be looking at. And so what I'm showing you here is our first real, what we can say is established settlement city, Çatalhöyük, and this would be in present-day Turkey, and we're dating this from 7,400 to 6,200 BCE. When we're looking at images like this then, or settlements like this, we're now moved into what we call the Neolithic time period. So the Neolithic time period is marked by people staying in one place, people becoming farmers, and people domesticating animals. This is our true first civilization, we would say, that emerges in the Neolithic time period. And there are a bunch of locations where this happens. We focus on the Middle East or the Near East, because this is where we have our first written language, but we have other places around the world where next week we'll be looking at, and I'll be mentioning these other places. But this is in Turkey, and you can see how the way they have the building structured is very different than how we would think of like an apartment building. They actually built one apartment right on top of the other apartment with no separation really, no alleyways, no division, and you would just go through one apartment to the next through these ladders, walking up these ladders. So a very different way of organizing their family groups or their groups of people than what we would think of today. We wouldn't be comfortable if we lived in an apartment building I don't think, and you had your neighbors having to walk through your apartment all the time to get to their apartment. On the walls we have painted images, and this image is of a deer. And you can see the deer is quite large here in comparison to the people. And we're not quite sure why they're doing this, but this person here seems to be pulling the tongue of the deer. And it is theorized that this was some kind of ritual that the young people had to do in this society, where if you were brave enough to go to this deer and pull its tongue, that this was a way that then you were an adult. That we have all of these different rituals that people do at this time period throughout these societies. It's kind of like today, the ritual would be when you are 16, you can get your learner's permit. When you're 21, you can go out and drink. Like these milestones that kind of lead into what we consider adulthood in our civilization. And we have the development of the use of clay to create sculptural figures in the round. So if you remember with the cave painting video that I made, I ended with this beautiful piece that was on the floor of bisons, and they were attached to the floor. So they would be considered a relief sculpture. But this sculpture is not attached to anything. It can be, we can go all the way around it. We can, it's not big, so we could actually pick it up, right? So this is called sculpture in the round. You can make huge sculptures in the round that can't be moved, but you can move around it. So it's a sculpture in the round. It doesn't have a back. It's not attached to anything. So this would be in what today is Romania. So we have a female figure here and a male figure. So let's just look at these two figures next to each other. And you'll see there's some distinct differences here. The female figure is very wide in the hips and the stomach area, just like the other sculptural image I have up from the Paleolithic time period, known as the Woman of Willendorf. And again, women, this is their role in life, is to have children, to be the nurturers. They needed to perpetuate the human race. It's not like today where we have overpopulation, and if you choose not to have a child, that's your choice. We actually need people to have fewer children in the world, right? At this time period, people needed to have children to make sure that the society continued. And she sits on the ground, so she's very close to the ground. She's linked to nature very closely because she's able to give birth. Where he sits on, look at this, a little stool. So he's elevated from the ground. And he leans on his hands, kind of looking up in contemplation. So he's deep in thought. So it shows really the division of labor within the society, which kind of is still held today, although we have really moved away from that, right, in the last 100 years. But women in this society were the caregivers. They took care of the children, they took care of the home, they were the domestic workers, where the men were the ones that went out and did the hunting, but also were the innovators, the thinkers, in that sense. And because they're staying put, they begin to develop some very basic forms of architecture. The most basic form is considered the post and lintel. So here we have two posts, and then we have a lintel across the top. This is really strong and a really efficient way to make a structure. However, there's some limits to it. So if you move the posts, you take the posts and you move them out from each other, the lintel, this piece across the top, will eventually bend in the middle here. It will bow and it will break. So it has its limitations. If you're inside at the moment and you look around, you'll see that we still use post and lintel structures today, and you will see within the door frame of the room that you're in is a post and lintel structure. So Next, what they started to do was to make post and lintel structures and put stones on top of them and then earth and create underground burial chambers. And from that, then they also stacked stones and put a big keystone on top and made corbelled underground burial chambers. They took wooden post frames and made these very simplistic kind of houses and structures. And then around the same time period of some other things we're going to look at in a second, we have Egypt that's developing. And we'll be getting to that in a couple weeks, into Egypt and Northern Africa. And they use the post and lintel structure, but on a much bigger scale, where they're making these big post and lintels that are next to each other, and the structures become their temples. And so we can look at the temple here, the Valley Temple of Khafra in Giza, Egypt, circa 2500 BCE. Very simple little drawing here of it. We'll be looking at it more closely in a few weeks. I'm going to end this video, and then I'm going to come back with the second one, and we're going to look at two burial chambers, or one burial chamber and one burial site in Northern Europe. So hang on one second.